Dear learners, I welcome you all to this course on understanding human rights. In our previous lecture, we discussed how terrorism and counterterrorism pose threat to human rights, and we had already identified that the study by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has discussed the specific human rights challenges. Um, you know, the study challenges in the context of terrorism and counterterrorism. So keep in mind that it is not only terrorism that is a threat to human rights, but the counter-terrorism is also a threat to human rights. That it has been identified by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Uh, the study identifies the following human rights that are threatened by terrorism and counter-terrorism. Keep in mind terrorism and counter-terrorism both. It means state terrorism and non-state terrorism both can be understood by understanding what are the threats that are involved in what is called terrorism and counter-terrorism operations. So the first thing is the right to life. The international and regional human rights law recognizes the right and duty of states to provide security of life to individual under their jurisdiction. This is the first right that it provides justification to the state. If the state is not able to protect the right to life of the people, then the very existence of a state will be in danger. And if you see why, according to Thomas Hobbes, a state was created. Why, according to John Locke, a state was created. According to John Locke, the state was created to protect what is called right to life, right to liberty, and right to property. Thomas Hobbes found that, in the absence of the state, right to life was in danger. There was perpetual war of all against all. So ultimately, you will find that right to life is the most basic right recognized everywhere in the world. It is not having any kind of reservation like cultural relativism, etc. So that's why the international and regional human rights law recognizes the right and duty of states to provide security of life to individual and under their jurisdiction. However, the states in many cases, now the office of the High Commissioner is pointing out in its studies that states in many cases have resorted to extrajudicial killings in the name of protecting individuals from acts of terrorism. So many suspects are killed. Extrajudicial killings were in the encounters, for example, because the due process of law is that a person is to be presumed innocent, and then of course unless proved otherwise, so there should be fair trial, and then only the punishment can be given. But what happens that in the name of fighting terrorists and in the name of counter terrorism, many a times it has been found that the state have resorted to extrajudicial killings in the name of protecting individuals from acts of terrorism. The study identifies deliberate, that is under inverted comma, deliberate or targeted killing. So the deliberate and targeted killings to eliminate a specific individuals as an alternative to arresting them and bringing them to justice. In other cases, states have adopted shoot to kill law enforcement policies in response to perceived terrorist threats. So, shoot to kill. So, if the security agencies are convinced that if the particular person is a terrorist, then this kind of policy, that is often called by the national governments as zero tolerance to terrorism. But the zero tolerance to terrorism, under that kind of circumstances, sometimes what happens that this shoot to kill policy also leads to killing of the innocent people. This practice is very common in developing countries. The United States and its allies in the war on terror have been continuously liquidating the suspected terrorists in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Somalia, and many other countries. You'll find drone attacks, for example. You'll find missile attacks, for example. When a missile is dropped or that is going to hit a target, you may understand that it is not going to discriminate between the terrorist and the people, those who are living over there. Most of the time, you'll find terrorists are living in the, among the people. So ultimately, because of that, what happens that while killing terrorists, many innocent people are also killed. Prohibition against torture. In spite of the fact that protection against torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment is absolute under international law. In no case torture can be inflicted. It cannot be acceptable at all in the international law. States without any honorable exception, you know, a state without any honorable exception resort to torture and cruel treatment against individuals. So the torture is a major phenomenon that has been identified because in the name of terrorism, what happens that the people are arrested or accused are arrested or suspects are arrested and then they face brutal torture. In fact, prohibition against torture is the most flagrantly violated rights in the current war on terror that was already highlighted. The accounts of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, including torture, rape, sodomy, and homicide of prisoners held in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq at the hands of the United States Army together with additional US governmental agencies is still fresh in the minds of all concerned people across the globe. That also became something that was criticized everywhere. In Abu Ghraib prison, the videos were also shown where the accused or the prisoners, how they were subjected to what is called, the physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, including torture, rape, sodomy, and homicide of prisoners. All these things were there. So that is why this United Nations is concerned with this. That torture is something that is most of the time you will find in the counterterrorism, which is reflected. The United States is also maintaining detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, where prisoners are being kept in brutal condition in defiance of provisions of international human rights and humanitarian law. That was also identified, by human rights organization, not by the United. It is not a United Nations that is, pointing out. But you will find that Guantanamo Bay or Guantanamo prison that became notorious all over the world for torture and for compromising with all human rights standard. So, these prisoners, they face all kind of torture. Their accounts were also shared by many human rights organizations and activists. So, that is another important phenomenon. The detention camp has been compared with concentration camps maintained by Nazis during the time of Hitler in Germany. If you see the human rights organizations pointing out that these, Guantanamo prisons were compared with concentration camp of, Nazis that were maintained by Hitler during the Second World War or before the war. So, despite concealing of the facts by states, torture and custodial deaths are often reported from several countries of the world. The current war on terror has considerably increased states' power, which is manifested in the style of functioning of security agencies in states who often resort to torture and other cruel methods to extract truth or to force an accused to accept the charges. These things have been documented by the human rights organization. If you see the reports of Human Rights Watch and other human rights organization, all these accounts you will find. Transfer of individuals suspect of terrorist activity. You see, the international human rights legal framework requires a strict adherence to human rights and the rule of law to conduct and transfer of detainees. So, if the detainees are there, or the prisoners are there, or the accused are there, there is already international law to govern it. However, in the wake of 9/11, some states have reportedly extradited, expelled, deported, or otherwise transferred foreign national, some of them asylum seekers, suspected of terrorism, to their country of origin or to other countries where they allegedly face a risk of torture or ill treatment in violation of the principle of non-refoulement. So the principle of non-refoulement, it means if a person has taken shelter, or he in a particular country, and he has run away from his own country of origin, then he should not be sent back to that particular country because for his political opinion or views he may be tortured, and that is called the principle of non-refoulement in the international law. But you'll find many countries have violated this principle of non-violation, non-refoulement, and they have sent back the people or the citizens to their country of origin, where they have faced or they have a danger of facing torture or even death. This is a serious crisis of international law which must be paid attention by the concerned bodies, otherwise, the terms like asylum and refugee will lose their meaning and substance. So, asylum means shelter with active protection. So, and that is a very important principle of international law. So, these terms like asylum and you'll find refugee, for example, a country is hosting people who have come from outside, uh, and so ultimately, if they are sent back to their own country, so that is violation of human rights, and that is why this has been pointed out by the various human rights organizations. Profiling and the principle of non-discrimination. So another important issue is profiling based on national or ethnic origin of a person is a major problem created by the current bout of terrorism and counter-terrorism. Profiling, stereotypes are already there. You'll find that the profiling, it means that after 9/11, it was found that Islamophobia became a global phenomenon. Why? Because most of the Muslims were, suspect at that time in many European and other countries, including United States of America. So, the profiling of the people based on national or ethnic origin of a person is a major problem created by current bout of terrorism and counterterrorism. After all, the security agencies, they have to apprehend the criminals or the perpetrators. They have to also, they not only have to apprehend the perpetrators, but their responsibility is to prevent terrorist strike. Otherwise, the country will be blamed, government will be blamed, security agencies will be blamed. So under these kind of circumstances, the security agencies took many precautionary measures in which the social profilings were also there, and that created problems for many people. Taking cognizance of the problem, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, in its General Recommendation number 30, 2004, has called on states to ensure that any measures taken in the fight against terrorism do not violate the principle of non discrimination. It means ethnic profiling or profiling based on national identity or religious identity. That is something that should not be there at all. Entire community cannot be blamed for the act of few individuals. That is the principle that is to be followed. It has also emphasized that non-citizens should not be subjected to racial or ethnic profiling or stereotyping. Non-citizens means the people who have migrated to other countries or illegally entered into other countries. So, these non-citizens should not be subjected to racial or ethnic profiling or stereotyping. Due process and the right to a fair trial. This is another internationally recognized right which is constantly under threat in the wake of terrorist attacks in different countries. So, in the name of counter-terrorism, again, you see what happened, that everybody has, whether a person is accused of heinous crime like terrorism, killing, and all. So, he or she is to be presumed innocent unless proved otherwise. That is the universally recognized principle of natural justice. So, what happens that a person should be accused, should be given right to a fair trial. Many countries have made anti-terrorism laws which are not in consonance with the international human rights norms of free and fair trial. Free and fair trial is not possible because if the person is accused and the accused is confessing something in the custody, then that confession can be admitted in the court. There are, if you see the national legislation in many countries of the world. So, because of that, there is no place for what is called right to a fair trial. Free and fair trial, if that is not there, then it casts shadow on the delivery system, justice delivery system in a country. So that is why that has been pointed out. The human rights protection for persons charged with criminal offences, including terrorism, emphasizes the right to be presumed innocent, the right to a hearing with due guarantees and within a reasonable time by a competent, independent, and impartial tribunal, and the right to have conviction and sentence reviewed by a higher tribunal satisfying the same standards. You see, this has been also mentioned. Besides the above, the study by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights identified threats to liberty and security, freedom of expression, right to privacy, and economic, social, and cultural rights as major human rights challenges in the context of terrorism and counterterrorism. So, not only those challenges that we have discussed, but you will find that these rights, other challenges or other rights that are threatened are right to life, security, freedom of expression, right to privacy, and economic, social, and cultural rights. The study has also noted the fact that in the absence of a comprehensive definition of terrorism, there is a scope for unintended human rights abuses and even the deliberate misuse of the term by the state. So, it is also calling for what? That there must be at least a working definition of terrorism, universally accepted definition of terrorism, because if there is nothing like a comprehensive definition of terrorism, then many people, they can be branded as terrorist, or the adversaries can be branded as terrorist. So that generous use of the term terrorism will be there. Flagrant use of the term terrorism will be there. And under that kind of circumstances, it will undermine the rights of the people to be presumed innocent and all. Now we are going to conclude our discussion on terrorism, counter-terrorism, and human rights. So terrorism has become a global menace, threatening most basic human rights. There is no doubt in it that terrorism is a global scourge, and it has assumed the status of a global menace because transnational actors, transnational terrorism, international terrorism, domestic terrorism, you will find different kind of uh, acts of violence that are there. What has happened that because of one thing, that is advancement of technology, and also because of globalization, the movement of people or free flow of goods and services has become easier. So because of that, you will find terrorism has also got globalized, and it has become a global phenomenon. So because of that, you see terrorism has assumed the status of a global menace, a global threat, threatening international peace and security, and threatening enjoyment of human rights. Again, another important aspect of this discussion we should have in our mind, there is no universally accepted definition of terrorism, which complicates the counter-terrorism measures. We discussed that, you see, if terrorism is not defined objectively or precisely, then that will create many problems. Problems like what? For example, if terrorism is not objectively defined, then our ambiguity is there in the definition of terrorism. What will happen? That the countries, security agencies, they will try to declare their adversaries, sometimes political opponents, and the people just on the ground of their particular kind of political opinion, they will be declared as terrorism. So they will be declared as terrorist, or their activities will be branded as terrorism. So, if that is happening, then counter-terrorism becomes difficult. Why? First of all, there should be a clear-cut definition of terrorism, so that there are people cannot hide behind the veil of ambiguity. That should be ensured, and this is the reason that it has been rightly pointed out that a universally accepted definition of terrorism is must, so that we can develop a very effective counter-terrorism strategy, which should be acceptable to all. So before that, a universally accepted definition of terrorism is something that is needed. States' counter-terrorism strategies also infringe upon the rights enjoyed by their citizens. This also we noticed that security agencies or the states through their legislations, they try to make stringent law, giving blanket power to the security agencies. The preventive detention law they make. So when the stringent power, blanket power is given to the security agencies, so these laws are capable of being misused, and they are misused. It has been found. So ultimately, because of that, you see that states' counter-terrorism strategies also infringe upon the rights enjoyed by their own citizens, you see. After all, what is the purpose of the creation of the state? A state has come into existence to protect the rights of the people. So if terrorism is becoming such a problem, or terrorists are in a position to provoke the state to violate the rights of their own citizens, who may be innocent in many, many cases, so we can understand that how dangerous terrorism is there. So while adopting counter-terrorism strategies, what is to be done? That utmost care is to be taken that not even a single innocent individual is targeted by the security agencies, because that will send a very wrong message. The global war on terror has been criticized for violating the human rights of people in many countries. You see, the American global war of terror, or America and its allies, they were criticized by human rights organizations and many other human rights activists, that this global war on terror is creating more terrorists rather than eliminating them, because it is developing gross sense of injustice in the minds of many, many people in the different parts of the world. So, American intervention, for example, in many countries in the name of war on terror, sometimes you will find in the bombings, or, or related with the counter-terrorism, innocent people were killed. In the missile attacks, you will find villages were wiped out. So, because of that, uh, the war on terror itself was criticized, which was a counter-terrorism measure, of course, because America was bound to retaliate. It was the innocent people working in WTC, they were attacked. So ultimately, a country has to retaliate. And the people, those who were targeting America, they were sitting outside America. So, there was no choice for America but to intervene. So that's why America intervened, but it was found that in its intervention in many countries, in the name of war on terror, what happened? That rights of many innocent people were also violated. While discussing terrorism, counter-terrorism, and human rights, we must remember the note of caution by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And what did he say? And this is an eye-opener for all of us. He said that we will not enjoy security without development. So, what is the precondition for security? Development. These days, you will find that, this statement, you can understand this sentence, that security, the military dimension of security is not emphasized more. Now, human dimension of security, that is human security, that is emphasized more. So, that is why this human security cannot be enjoyed or cannot be achieved without development. He further says, we will not enjoy development without security. Again, the security and development will go together. It is rightly said that, peace and prosperity go together. So, both are interdependent. So, the security is a necessary condition for development, and development is a necessary condition for security. And he further says, you see, that we will not enjoy security without development, we will not enjoy development without security, and we will not enjoy either without human rights. So we will neither enjoy security nor development without human rights. So it means, what is the foundational pillar of security and development? It is human rights. So that is why human rights should not be compromised in any circumstances whatsoever, because that will be counterproductive. If human rights are violated, and especially the human rights of innocent people are violated in the name of counter-terrorism, terrorists will of course violate. Terrorism itself is a violation of human rights. If you see, terrorism in all its forms and manifestation is basically threatening human rights. But the counter-terrorism is something that you have to fight against terrorism. But while fighting against terrorism, if the state is also violating the rights of the people, then what is the difference between terrorist and the state? That is to be understood. So the legitimacy of the state, the authority of the state, all will be in danger. So therefore, this note of caution issued by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan is important. I repeat the statement: we will not enjoy security without development, we will not enjoy development without security, and we will not enjoy either without human rights. Again, we should remember that there are universally recognized non-derogable rights that cannot be compromised even during a time of emergency or war. So, there are certain universally recognized non-derogable rights, the rights which cannot be taken away even during emergency. So, these non-derogable rights, for example, right to life, for example, right against non-discrimination, these rights, right to a fair trial, right against torture. So even, during emergency or war, these rights cannot be compromised. So in the name of counter-terrorism, these rights should not be compromised at all. These rights should not be violated in any circumstances whatsoever. It has been accepted. So that way, these non-derogable rights are also violated during counter-terrorism. So with this, we are going to conclude now. Just to recapitulate, because we had a long discussion on terrorism, counter-terrorism, and human rights. This issue of terrorism and counter-terrorism is very important. Why? Because the number one problem is that there is no universally accepted definition of terrorism. That creates a lot of confusion. And the second thing is that our ambivalence towards violence. And that is one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. This will also be there because there is no clear-cut definition, objective, precise definition of terrorism. The third important dimension we have to again keep in mind that terrorism is a major threat to human rights, which has been recognized even by the United Nations. Now terrorism has become global, and because of the advancement of science and technology, you'll find, and because of the ease that we have under a globalized economy for what is called the free flow of goods and services, terrorists are also in a position to operate freely from the different parts of the world. Fundraising also becomes important, easier for them. So the terrorists are also able to strike, in any corner of the world. So this is the reason that terrorism has become a global scourge. When it has become a global scourge, of course, it should be countered. And when we are going to counter it, what happens that state agencies are there to counter terrorism. There is already multinational coalition. You'll find many nations have come together to fight against terrorism. But while fighting against terrorism, or while going for counter-terrorism operations or missions, what is to be understood that human rights of common masses should not be compromised. What has happened because of the uh, projection of terrorism as a major threat? Most of the states have got the power or authority to make stringent laws. These laws are termed by human rights organizations as draconian laws, black laws, because they have provisions that can threaten human rights of innocent people, especially right to a fair trial, right to be presumed innocent, the universal principle of natural justice. So that is why, this criticism you will find. So the terrorism and counter-terrorism both together are violating human rights. So that is why it is a challenge. And we also discussed that, the terrorists themselves are warning, or rather they are saying that we should provoke a state to retaliate, disproportionately with high power and force, and that will anger the people, and by that way, the alienation of the state, alienation of the people or citizens against the state will increase, and that will good for that will also create what is called fertile breeding ground for terrorism. So the while discussing the causes of terrorism, we highlighted all these things. And finally, we found that there are certain non-derogable rights. Even in the name of counter-terrorism, these rights cannot be violated. These rights are right to life, right to liberty, for example, right to a fair trial, for example, right to be presumed innocent, unless proved otherwise, for example, and again, right against torture. So what was reported that in the name of counter-terrorism, torture, the phenomenon of torture increased globally. So that's why with this, we are going to conclude our discussion on terrorism, counter-terrorism, and human rights. Thank you.